1963, Los Angeles. A closed-door charity night for veterans. No press seats, no second chances. On stage stands Bob Hope, the one man in America allowed to joke about anyone and walk away untouched. He smiles, lets the pause stretch, then drops a line about the Rat Pack. Light. Clever. Safe enough to earn laughter. The room responds on instinct. Cameras swing across familiar faces, catching approval, amusement, relief. And then they catch Dean Martin. The smile is gone, not replaced by anger, not by offense, by something quieter, colder. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask for attention but changes the air anyway. Most people miss it, but a few don't. They see Dean's eyes drift past the stage, past the joke, toward the men who paid for the night. The men who decide which careers stay playful and which get trimmed down to punchlines. Nothing explodes. No words are exchanged. The show keeps moving. Yet those who know Dean understand one thing immediately. He isn't reacting. He's deciding. And once he does, the evening, and more than a few reputations, will no longer follow the script. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The applause rolled through the hall like warm weather, loud and careless. Television lights burned white above the stage, flattening faces, bleaching out wrinkles, turning everyone into something presentable. Cigarette smoke hung low, caught in the beams, drifting slowly as if the room itself was tired. The orchestra had just finished a bright, polished sting, and Bob Hope stepped forward with the easy confidence of a man who had never truly bombed in his life. He didn't lean into the microphone. He never needed to. His voice carried on habit alone. The joke came out light, almost affectionate. A few words about late nights, loose ties, and a certain group of Vegas boys who, according to him, had turned excess into a business model. Then the line landed. Not sharp, not cruel, but dismissive. A drunken circus for rich people. Delivered with a smile. Framed as love. The room laughed. Not explosively, but comfortably. The kind of laughter that means no one feels personally at risk. Cameras cut automatically, trained by instinct, searching for reactions. They found clapping hands, nodding heads, a few knowing grins. And then, briefly, they found Dean Martin. He didn't smile. No tightening of the jaw, no raised eyebrow. His face stayed exactly where it had been a second earlier, relaxed, unreadable, almost distant. If anything, he looked bored. The director hesitated, then switched angles, assuming the moment hadn't landed yet. But it had. Dean didn't look at Hope, not even for a heartbeat. His gaze slid past the stage lights and into the audience, fixing itself on the darker rows where suits sat straighter than they clapped. Men with pins on their lapels. Men who laughed late, after checking who else was laughing first. The applause swelled again, obedient, filling the space where discomfort might have grown. The band readied another cue. The show kept moving. From the outside, it all worked. A successful line, a safe target. A room reassured that the edges of the culture were still under control. Behind the stage, no one laughed. An assistant producer leaned toward another and whispered something that didn't need answering. A stage manager glanced toward the wings, waiting for a signal that never came. Dean didn't stand, didn't leave, didn't do the expected thing. That was the problem. Everyone who worked these rooms knew the difference between an act and a choice. They had seen Dean play drunk for years, play it so well that people forgot it was a performance. They had seen him shrug off worse jokes, sharper digs, louder disrespect. What they hadn't seen was this kind of stillness. Because this wasn't timing. This was restraint. The Rat Pack, to the audience, was a punchline. To the men backstage, it was payroll. Drivers, horn players, arrangers, lighting crews, hotel staff. Names that never made it onto posters. A moving operation that fed hundreds of families without ever announcing itself as such. Reduce it to a joke, and the joke stuck. Sponsors remembered. Executives simplified. Doors closed quietly. Dean knew that, and so did a few other people in the room. The cameras missed the most important detail. His eyes didn't harden. They calculated. As Hope rolled into the next bit, and the orchestra filled the space again, Dean finally shifted in his seat. Not to applaud, just enough to cross one leg over the other, settling in as if he had nowhere else to be. The audience thought the moment had passed, but the silence he carried with him didn't lift. It stretched forward, thin and patient, following the show beat by beat. And somewhere between the laughter and the lights, the sense settled in. Not that something had gone wrong on stage, but that something had been noticed. That was worse, because jokes faded. Decisions didn't. Dean didn't leave when the applause told him it was time. Most people would have. That was the choreography of these nights. Laugh, clap, exit cleanly before anyone asked questions. Dean stayed seated, hands resting loosely on his knees, eyes forward, as if the rest of the room had slowed without permission. 15 minutes can feel like nothing on television. In a hall like this, under lights that never quite cooled, it stretched. Bob Hope moved on, effortless as ever. Another joke. Another cue. The band obeyed. The show continued to reassure itself that it was still in control. From the audience, Dean looked like a man enjoying the performance. Up close, the difference was obvious. He watched the room, not the stage. Watched who leaned toward whom, who whispered, who smiled a second too late. These were not fans. These were people who funded seasons, canceled pilots, rewrote careers with a phone call placed after dessert. A waiter paused beside him with a tray. Dean shook his head slightly. No drink. That, too, was noticed. The joke hadn't touched his pride. If it had, he would have laughed it off like a professional. What it touched was something smaller and heavier. A week earlier, quietly, without press releases or plaques, the Rat Pack had headlined a private benefit. Not glamorous, not televised. A room full of aging musicians whose names had been erased by studio contracts and new formats. Men who'd been told the sound had changed, and they hadn't. The money raised wasn't symbolic. It paid rent. It paid medical bills. It kept horns in hands that were starting to shake. Dean had made the calls himself. He also knew that one of the men in the third row, conservative tie, cautious smile, had leaned toward Hope before the show and said lightly that maybe it was time to remind people not to take the Vegas boys too seriously. Not a demand. A suggestion. The kind that pretends to be harmless. Hope didn't know the whole story. He didn't need to. His position allowed him to swing without checking who stood behind the target. Television loved him. The military loved him. America trusted him. That kind of goodwill came with insulation. Dean understood that too, so he didn't confront him. Not here, not publicly, not ever. Instead, when the show broke for a longer segment and movement rippled through the aisles, Dean stood. Slowly. Not toward the exit. Toward the back. He spoke to no one at first. Just placed a hand on shoulders, exchanged quiet words, asked questions that sounded like courtesy. How are things going? How's the new slate looking? Heard you're expanding the fall schedule. Money listens when it isn't being challenged. By the time Hope returned for the closing moments, Dean had already shifted the room. Not visibly. Subtly. the way pressure changes before weather. A producer noticed. Then another. Someone asked why Dean hadn't left yet. No one had an answer that felt safe. When the final applause came, Dean joined it briefly, politely. He didn't wait for hope. He didn't look for acknowledgement. He moved out through a side corridor, unhurried. Behind him, the laughter faded faster than usual. The joke would be remembered, but not for the reason it was written. By the time Dean reached the cool night air, the conversation had already changed. The corridor behind the stage narrowed into something quieter, the kind of space never meant for audiences. The carpet was older here, darker from years of traffic that didn't make programs. A single bulb buzzed above a fire door, casting light that refused to flatter anyone. Dean stopped near a small lounge reserved for headliners who needed silence more than mirrors. He didn't knock. He waited. Bob Hope came a minute later, jacket loosened, smile still half-assembled out of habit. He closed the door behind him and glanced instinctively toward the walls, as if expecting microphones. There were none. That, finally, changed his expression. Dean spoke first. He thanked him. Not theatrically, not warmly. Just a clean acknowledgement of a tight show. Good timing. A room well handled. The words landed wrong because they didn't accuse. Hope hesitated, recalibrating, searching for the expected punchline that never arrived. Dean remained standing. No drink, no cigarette. Hands open, relaxed. The posture of a man who wasn't there to win anything. He didn't mention the joke, not directly. Instead, he talked about travel, about how many cities they'd hit that year, about the men who packed up brass instruments every Sunday night and waited for the next call. He spoke in numbers, not names. How many depended on the circuit, how thin the margins had become, how fast reputations hardened once television decided what a thing was. Hope listened. He didn't interrupt. He tried to smile once, out of reflex, then let it go. Dean finally looked at him then. Not sharply, almost apologetically. He said that when people laughed at the idea of the Rat Pack, they weren't laughing at excess. They were laughing at labor they didn't see, at crews who never stood under lights, at men who would never be invited into rooms like this one, but still paid the cost of being associated with them. His voice stayed level. No tremor, no sermon. "I don't mind the jokes," he said quietly. "I mind what sticks after." That was it. No warning, no request. Just a simple fact laid on the table between them. Hope exhaled through his nose, slow. For the first time that night, he didn't have a line ready. His power had always lived in momentum. Keep moving, keep smiling, never let the room settle. Here, there was nowhere to move. Dean finished with the only sentence that carried weight. "You laugh from the stage," he said. "I look at them after." Silence filled the room, dense and uncomfortable, the kind that forces men to hear themselves think. Hope nodded once. Not in agreement. In recognition. Dean didn't wait for a response. He opened the door and stepped back into the corridor, already loosening his tie, the night reclaiming him. Hope stayed behind, staring at a wall that suddenly felt closer than it had before. The conversation ended there. The consequences didn't. Nothing happened the next day. That was the first sign. No headlines, no rebuttals, no carefully worded apologies floating out of publicists' offices. The industry liked noise when it wanted to bury something. Silence meant calculation. Dean noticed the gap 3 days later, not from an agent or a lawyer, but from a trumpet player nursing a drink at a bar just off Sunset. The man spoke casually, almost embarrassed, like he wasn't sure the information mattered. A network promo reel had been updated. A fall special reshuffled. A familiar group photo quietly replaced with a neutral graphic and a new phrase. Format refresh. Dean didn't react. He asked what the guy was drinking and paid the tab. By the end of the week, the pattern sharpened. A phone call that never came. A meeting postponed without a new date. Names missing from internal memos that used to circulate freely. No one said "canceled." They never did. They said risk management, tone alignment, optics. Someone, somewhere, had decided that a joke had given permission. Studios in the 60s didn't blacklist loudly. They blurred edges until careers softened into something easier to move around. Images mattered more than truth, and unpredictability, even the appearance of it, made executives nervous. The Rat Pack had always lived on that edge, selling danger while delivering discipline. Now the danger was being redefined without their consent. Dean learned the full scope of it, the same way he learned most things. Indirectly. A contract he'd already agreed to arrived back on his desk with new language. Shorter run. Optional appearances. A polite downgrade disguised as flexibility. He read it once, then pushed it aside. Instead of calling his attorney, Dean called the producer and declined the project himself. No counteroffer, no conditions, just a clean withdrawal. The move landed wrong. Walking away from airtime was not how this business worked. Television was oxygen. You didn't refuse it unless you were desperate or reckless. Dean was neither, and that confusion spread faster than outrage ever could. Within days, people started whispering. Not about what he'd lost, about what he might know. If he could afford to step back, maybe the ground wasn't as stable as it looked. Maybe the joke had cut deeper than anyone admitted. Dean didn't correct them. He kept working. Quiet appearances, private rooms, commitments that didn't require posters or cameras. Every decision seemed smaller than the last, yet each one landed precisely where it needed to. Meanwhile, the networks watched. They waited for him to blink, to complain, to reach back for the platform they assumed he needed. He didn't. That unsettled them more than anger ever would have, because the game only functioned when everyone agreed to want the same things. Dean had changed that equation without announcing it. He wasn't pushing against the system. He was stepping outside its leverage. The absence became louder than any scandal. And in that widening quiet, it became clear that the joke on stage had been the least important thing said that night. The real shift was happening where no one could point to it, yet no one could ignore it either. The room in Las Vegas had no signage, no posters, no marquee glowing out front to announce who mattered inside. It was chosen deliberately. A private lounge tucked behind the casino floor, insulated from the noise by thick walls and heavier habits. The kind of place where deals survived because no one needed credit for them. Dean arrived early, not to rehearse, to set the temperature. Chairs adjusted. Lights lowered just enough to soften faces without hiding them. Drinks placed where they would not interrupt hands. Control lived in details most performers never noticed. There were no cameras. That alone shifted the posture of the men entering. Casino owners, booking managers, distribution partners who rarely sat still unless something important was about to happen. They greeted Dean with familiarity, not affection. Respect here was practical. The Rat Pack didn't make an entrance. They walked on. No loose banter, no exaggerated swagger. Jackets sharp, shoes clean. The band tight from the first bar. Timing exact enough to feel effortless. What the room saw wasn't rebellion, it was precision. Dean sang without leaning on irony. No self-parody, no wink. His voice filled the space evenly, controlled, reminding everyone that this had always been the core of the operation. Around him, the others followed the same discipline, not toned down, refined. The effect was immediate and unsettling. People had built comfortable myths around these men. Myths were easy to manage. This version required attention. The room leaned forward, not because it was loud, but because nothing was wasted. Every pause landed. Every transition held. Dean didn't joke between numbers. He didn't need to. The silence between songs did the work for him, allowing the audience to recalibrate what they thought they were watching. In the back, a man Hope trusted observed carefully. Not sent to negotiate, sent to measure. He took notes he wouldn't admit to later. When the final note faded, there was no rush to applaud. Just a moment of recalculation, followed by genuine appreciation. The difference mattered. Afterward, there was no speech, no announcement. Dean moved through the room naturally, speaking when approached, listening more than he talked. He never explained the performance. He let it stand on its own terms. A casino executive said it quietly, almost to himself. Television suddenly felt small. Another nodded. Not in agreement, in acknowledgement. The message reached Hope the next morning in fewer words than the joke that had started everything. Not a threat, not a complaint, an assessment. The Rat Pack wasn't a liability. It was an asset being undervalued by people who no longer controlled the room. Hope didn't respond. That, too, was information. Dean understood then that the center of gravity had shifted. Not publicly, not permanently, but enough. He hadn't challenged the stage. He'd redrawn the map around it. From here on, whatever happened would not be about humor or pride. It would be about who decided what mattered, and where. The shift became visible weeks later, in a place Dean never tried to control. A televised veterans' benefit, neutral ground, flags, polished speeches, an audience trained to applaud at the right moments. Bob Hope stood center stage again, older now in posture if not reputation, carrying the evening with the same practiced ease. The camera loved him. It always had. Dean wasn't scheduled to appear. That fact alone drew attention. Backstage, producers whispered about it like a technical problem. Invitations had made the rounds. Dean had declined without explanation, wishing them well and nothing more. No tension, no conditions, just absence. Hope knew he was watching the room alone this time. Midway through his set, he reached for familiar territory. The rhythm of light teasing, cultural shorthand everyone understood. The Rat Pack line was there, waiting, easy to resurrect. The audience leaned in, expecting the echo. Hope didn't take it. He paused instead, just long enough for the beat to stretch. Then he smiled, softer than usual, and redirected. A remark about professionals who carried more than they showed. About discipline hidden behind charm. It wasn't praise, it wasn't apology, but it wasn't dismissal either. People noticed. The change rippled outward in small ways. A columnist mentioned maturity, where he might have written mockery. A producer reintroduced a name into a conversation he'd quietly removed weeks earlier. No announcements, just recalibration. Dean watched none of it live. He was in Palm Springs that night, sitting at an outdoor table with 2 musicians and a booking agent who hadn't worked television in years. They talked about schedules, about logistics, about who still needed work after the holidays. Dean listened, nodded, made notes on a napkin he'd later lose. When the agent mentioned the benefit and Hope's adjusted tone, Dean didn't respond immediately. He finished his drink first. "That's his business," he said finally. Not dismissive. Complete. The agent waited for more. There wasn't any. Dean had a choice now. Everyone saw it. He could re-enter loudly, Let the industry frame the shift as reconciliation. A shared laugh, a tidy ending the audience could understand. He didn't. Instead, he accepted a smaller offer from a regional network. No prestige, no headlines. A limited run, focused on music, tightly produced. No room for caricature. He negotiated one condition only: full control of format. The decision puzzled people who mistook scale for power. Behind the scenes, it did more damage than a feud ever could. It proved that Dean didn't need the biggest stage to define himself. He could build something quieter and still command loyalty, still draw talent, still deliver value that didn't bend to jokes. Hope heard about the deal weeks later. He understood then that the moment had passed. Not the conflict, the leverage. Dean hadn't forced a change. He'd simply moved on, carrying the weight with him. And that, in this business, was the strongest signal there was. The final change didn't arrive with applause. It came months later, folded into an ordinary evening that looked unremarkable from the outside. A studio taping, clean stage, modest orchestra. No spectacle built to announce significance. The kind of program executives once ignored because it didn't shout for attention. Dean walked on without introduction. No backstory, no reference to past tensions. He stood where the light met him naturally, adjusted the microphone by habit, and waited for the room to settle. It did. Instinctively. He sang first. Not a statement piece. Not a challenge. A measured song that carried restraint in its phrasing. The orchestra followed him, not leading, not competing. The camera stayed wide longer than planned, uncertain where the moment was supposed to peak. It never did, and that was the point. Between songs, Dean spoke briefly. Not about himself, not about history. He thanked the musicians by name. He acknowledged the crew. He let the silence after land without rushing to fill it. Viewers at home felt it even if they couldn't name it. This wasn't a man trying to win back space. This was someone defining it. The industry noticed in its own language. Ratings came back steady. Not explosive. Reliable. Advertisers didn't panic. Musicians asked to be booked. Younger performers studied the format instead of parodying it. The image shifted without permission. No one ever corrected the joke. It simply stopped being useful. Bob Hope watched the broadcast alone, later than he intended. He didn't laugh. He didn't frown. He recognized Cheetah much, not defeat, not victory, finality. The room had moved, and it hadn't asked him to come along. There was no call. No reconciliation staged for headlines. That would have required Dean to return to the story as written. He never did. Instead, he kept choosing work that looked smaller and carried more weight. He kept placing people where they could survive. He kept control quiet and consistent, refusing to dramatize what had already settled. Years later, when someone mentioned that old line, the circus, the laughter, Dean responded with a shrug that meant nothing and everything. He didn't correct the memory. He didn't reclaim the narrative. He let results stand in for defense. In rooms that mattered, the lesson remained clear. Humor could frame a moment, but it couldn't define a legacy unless the man being framed agreed to stay inside it. Dean never did. He walked past the punchline, closed the door behind him, and left the stage exactly where it belonged. Working, dignified, and no longer available for dismissal.